This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, it is another in my series on the major religions. This time up, we'll be talking about Mormonism. I have two experts, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Patrick Mason and Paul Reeve are my guests. We will be talking about Mormonism. I like to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, their background, anything they've written about the subject. So let me start and ask Patrick. Patrick, if you could give a little background about yourself and your work on Mormonism.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan, for having me. So I hold the R.W. Hunter Chair in Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, and I'm trained as a historian of American religious history, and have done most of my work on Mormonism and the Mormon tradition, and I've published, authored or edited a number of different books on the tradition, including most recently a textbook called What is Mormonism? A Student's Introduction, which is an overview to the religion's history and beliefs and rituals and culture.
And what drew you to Mormonism? Were you raised in the Mormon faith?
I was, and I continue to be a practicing a member of the church, and so I didn't necessarily plan on studying Mormonism when I went to graduate school. As I said, I specialized in American religious history and planned on and studied things beyond Mormonism. But just the way life turned out, I ended up doing most of my research and then getting this professional position where I focus mostly on Mormonism.
And let me just ask, is Mormonism the correct term? Because I know Mormons call themselves Latter-day Saints, or is it Latter-day Saintism to a Mormon?
Well, in terms of the ism, Mormonism would be the correct term. There's some debate on how to use the term and how to use it most appropriately, partly because there are actually many different churches or traditions which all descend from the founding prophet Joseph Smith. But the largest church that I'm a member of and study mostly is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So typically when people say Mormonism, they mean the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the LDS Church or Latter-day Saints. Those are all essentially synonyms.
Okay, the man on the left is Paul Reeve. Let me ask you, Paul, if you could give a little background about yourself as well.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm a professor of history at the University of Utah. I teach Utah history of the U.S. West, and Mormonism. My first book was Making Space on the Western Frontier, Mormons, Miners, and Southern Paiutes. My more recent book looks at the intersections between Mormonism, race, and whiteness. It's called Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness.
And were you also raised as a Mormon as well?
Yes, I grew up and continue to be a practicing Latter-day Saint.
Well, let me, before we get to the history of the religion and some of the more famous things, like I recently did a show on polygamy that was beyond just Mormonism, worldwide polygamy. Probably the most essential question I think that people who are not Mormons, be they agnostics or other religions, would ask is, are Mormons Christians? Do they consider themselves Christians? And do non-Mormon Christians consider Mormons Christians? Paul, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yes, I think there was a Pew Center survey that asked that question, and I think it was 97% of Latter-day Saints respondents answered that yes, they consider themselves to be Christian, and everyone wondered about the other 3%. But the question then is, do other Christians consider Mormons to be Christian? And sometimes the answer is no. Most famously, Reverend Robert Jeffress, when Mitt Romney was running for the presidency, called Mormonism a non-Christian cult. So that's a part of Mormonism's fraught kind of efforts at identifying as a Christian faith.
How about you, Patrick? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's an interesting question that has been taken up mostly in recent decades. And the boundaries of what constitutes Christianity have always been disputed for a long time. Most Protestants believed that Roman Catholics were not Christian, or they would not use that term to describe them. So these boundaries are always disputed, and there's a kind of political and theological edge to them. My own view is that Mormonism sits squarely with the Christian tradition, but it is true that it doesn't share some of the same history and theological dimensions of other aspects of Christianity. And so I think when you look at Christianity, there are multiple branches of it. Of course, Roman Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism. I'd put Mormonism alongside them as a fourth branch of Christianity, certainly part of the family tree, but with enough distinctive aspects that it actually exists sort of in parallel to those traditions. It's not a Protestant tradition. It's not a Catholic tradition. It operates outside of those sort of historic and theological legacies.
Well, we have to start with Mormonism back with Joseph Smith. I want to talk a little bit about the founding father, if you will, of that. And I think Paul just mentioned how Mitt Romney, when he was running for president, sort of distanced himself from his own Mormon roots and called it a cult. And a lot of people here in the U.S., at least, have been very negative about Mormonism, calling it a cult. Certainly things with the polygamy, and there are still offshoots of mainstream Mormonism that practice polygamy. Would it be fair to say that Mormonism, at least in the 19th century, was viewed with sort of the same skeptical eye as, say, something like Scientology is today, i.e. that it was founded by someone who most people consider dubious, in the case of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and in the case of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. So let's talk about who Joseph Smith was and before he had his visions. Where did he come from? What was his background, etc. Patrick, if you want to go.
Yeah, sure. And just to correct one thing, I mean, Mitt Romney actually didn't really distance himself from his Mormon faith, and he wasn't the one who called Mormonism a cult. It was an evangelical pastor who called Mormonism a cult during the Romney campaign. Romney is actually, by all accounts, a very devout Latter-day Saint. He was quite proud of his religion. But in terms of going to Joseph Smith, you're right. So he's the founding prophet of the religion. The story begins in early 19th century America. Joseph Smith is a young man. His family moves around a fair bit, but ends up in upstate New York. Whereas as a young teenager, by his own account, he was confused by the various churches. And trying to essentially discover God and discover which church to join. Long story short, he encounters a passage in the Bible that gives him the confidence to go and pray, which he does one day in the spring of 1820, and he reports that he has a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ. Over the course of his life, he gave multiple accounts of that, and the accounts differ somewhat, but there's a general correlation on them in terms of what he had as this visionary experience. And that's the first in a series of visions that he has over the next several years, include an encounter with an angel named Moroni, who leads him, he said, miraculously to some golden plates that were buried in a hillside near his house, which he then, by his own account, through the power of God, was able to translate into what we now have as the Book of Mormon, which is one of the founding scriptures of Mormonism alongside the Bible. So it's a miraculous story, it's a remarkable story that all centers on a series of visionary events and miraculous events happening in the life of a young Joseph Smith in the 1820s.
Paul, do you have anything to add about Smith before we move on?
Well, the other part of your question was just how he was perceived, and I think Patrick did a great job of introducing who Smith was and his early visionary experiences. I would just add that for those who were searching, and Smith claimed to restore primitive Christianity, and that message appealed to a certain segment of the American population and also to people in international locations, to be a restorationist tradition. So there was a certain appeal, and he attracted followers quite readily. But those who were skeptical defined him as a fraud, a charlatan. Some labeled him the American Muhammad. So in a variety of ways, people were trying to figure out what to do with Smith and his religious claims. And some embraced him, but Protestant America, for the large part, shunned him and attempted to try to situate him in ways that suggested that he didn't fit into what it meant to be a religious person or a prophet. Tried to define him as a heretic and a fraud and a charlatan.
Well, let me just ask, because Patrick had brought it up, what was he before he founded Mormonism? Was he raised as a Quaker, a Catholic? What religion, if any, did he have before?
Well, his family studied the Bible, but were not associated with a particular religion. His father explicitly stayed away. His family explored different religions, so they grounded their faith in a study of the Bible. Joseph Smith toyed with Methodism. His family, his mother, also looked around, explored Presbyterianism, but remained aloof from the other religions that were available at the time.
Let's just talk a little bit about Mormonism as initially conceived, because Patrick had mentioned restorationists, and I'll turn to Patrick first. There are a lot of very strict Protestant faiths. A lot of people like Calvin and Luther basically founded their ideas of Christianity as a revolt against papism, that the Pope, in a sense, was a false god, and that they were going to get back to the roots, the Protestant work ethic, that kind of thing. Do you put Smith alongside in that continuum with the Luthers and the Calvins as someone who wanted to get away from all the ornate fanciness of Roman Catholicism?
Well, Smith is certainly an inheritor of that Reformation tradition, just as most of early American religious history was situated within that legacy. But actually, Smith had a different kind of religious project. Reformers like Luther and Calvin believed, as you correctly stated, that they wanted to get back to the original text. That the term that they often used was sola scriptura. That through Scripture alone they could apprehend the will of God and true doctrines of Christianity. They didn't need all of the structure and the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. Joseph Smith certainly inherited a lot of those ideas, but he actually, in some ways, went a step further. He was not a reformer, but a restorationist. He believed that all of Christianity was, to some degree, corrupt. That you couldn't just kind of put the pieces back together or cobble together,
Well, let me just ask you, Patrick, when you say corrupt, are you saying fundamentally corrupt in terms of principles, or, for example, I know a lot of Protestantism, severe Protestantism, always looked at the gold and the money and the avarice of the Catholic Church, supposedly. Was it a combination of both principle and avarice?
Well, I think for Joseph Smith, less the latter. I mean, he didn't, especially as a young man, he didn't encounter very many Catholics. He didn't see a lot of gilded churches, or there weren't indulgences being sold in upstate New York in 1820. So he didn't have that kind of animus. I think he inherited some of the prejudices against Roman Catholicism that were common in early America. But his project was really more focused on what he thought to be the true forms and power of Christianity, which he thought had been lost over the centuries. He referred to the church being in apostasy, that since the death of the apostles after Jesus, that power had been lost, that truth had been lost, that proper rituals were no longer performed. And so he believed that, and would say he didn't come up with this himself, but that it was actually the message that God gave to him through these visionary experiences and the revelations that he received, that God had called him to restore Christianity to its primitive form, to essentially bypass 1,700 years of Christian history and go back to the first century. Mm-hmm. That was Joseph Smith's project. He thought he wasn't building a new church, but rather restoring Jesus' primitive church.
Paul, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so I would just add the notion of authority becomes very important to Smith as well. So where do you get authority from? And, surveying the religious landscape, you could go to divinity school, or you could be a part of the Catholic Church and claim to inherit it from Christ. And because Smith articulates this notion that there was a falling away, an apostasy, that in fact it needed to be restored. And so his claims to authority, he says that John the Baptist visits him as a resurrected being and restores the authority to baptize by the laying on of hands. And then he claims that Peter, James, and John appear to him as resurrected beings and restore additional authority. And so he's claiming, once again, his authority is traceable back through these members of Jesus' movement to the people themselves who held authority in the primitive church. So that's his effort at restorationism and claiming to trace his authority back to those original people themselves.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the vision supposedly that led Smith to found the church. And there's always been controversy. I'd mentioned how some people have compared Mormonism to the next century Scientology, in that a lot of people have found that the Book of Mormon, and we will talk about the hierarchy. I think Mormon was the original prophet. Moroni was the son who was an angel who came to Smith. But that a lot of that had been plagiarized from a number of other works. What are both of your stands on that? Because there have been a number of books written both by ex-Mormons and lay people outside of Mormonism that have shown some pretty interesting correspondence in sort of the idea of the visions. Do you think that Smith actually had a vision, or do you think that Smith had ideas to found the religion and just sort of, took words here and there? Because if you look at some of the arguments that parts of the Book of Mormon were plagiarized, there are some startling similarities. Would you admit? Let me go with Patrick.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of questions embedded there. So first of all, as for the Book of Mormon, you're right that very early on, as soon as the book was produced, it was published in 1830, just a couple of months before Joseph Smith founded the church, which was then known as the Church of Christ. And the Book of Mormon was really kind of the calling card. I mean, it was pretty remarkable for an otherwise ordinary farm boy in upstate New York to produce this nearly 600-page religious text, which is fairly intricate in terms of its narrative structure, characters, and theology, and other things like this. And so from the very beginning, people were trying to explain it and explain it away, because, of course, if you didn't accept Smith's miraculous account for it, that it came from angels and gold plates translated by the power of God, then you had to come up with some other explanation for it. So one of the very early explanations was the charge of plagiarism. And the most common version of this was known as the Spalding Erie, or the Solomon Spalding manuscript, where it was believed that there was a manuscript by a guy named Solomon Spalding that had some similar characteristics to the Book of Mormon, that somehow, although people never quite were able to prove the connection, that somehow Joseph Smith must have gotten his hands on this manuscript and therefore plagiarized it as he wrote the Book of Mormon. I think careful scholarship, both by Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints, have shown that the charge of plagiarism is relatively empty. The Book of Mormon is a unique and distinctive work. Now, where it comes from, come from God and angels, or does it come from the mind of Joseph Smith? Well, that's an entirely different question. But I think we can mostly lay aside the plagiarism claim. Now, with that said, it's clear that Joseph Smith's revelatory output does have a number of consonances with his culture at the time, and so again, it's a question of how does one explain that? Does one a kind of faithful apologetic view would be, well, of course, if when Joseph Smith is receiving revelations, they speak to his culture and speak to the issues of the day, because that's what God would want him to talk about. The same way that Jesus spoke in the idiom of his day and spoke to the issues of first century Palestine. Where a more critical view would be that Joseph Smith is just making it up as he goes along and cobbling together. He's a kind of genius eclecticist. He brings these sources together, but there's nothing really original or inspired about it.
Paul, what are your thoughts on if there was any plagiarism or not?
Yeah, so I agree with Patrick. I think the charges of plagiarism are probably the least sophisticated accusations leveled against the Book of Mormon. I've never seen anything that is substantiated or demonstrates any sort of level of sophistication in terms of a plagiarism accusation. But like Patrick said, the more difficult problems are, well, is this just something that Joseph Smith, produces answering the questions of his time, or does this really have ancient origins? Is it, the historicity claims of the Book of Mormon continue to be debated and ultimately are not solvable in my estimation, unless we have some breakthrough with new evidence. These are matters of faith for people who believe, and those who accept it as scripture. It becomes a matter of faith, accepting Smith's claims of translation and revelation. And for people on the inside, those who believe, accept the historicity, that there were, in fact, people named Mormon and Moroni lived in the Americas, pre-Columbia. And others, like Patrick said, dismiss this as just simply, fabrication of Smith's mind. A largely unschooled farm boy producing in about 90 days a 500-page book with hundreds of characters, all kinds of internal consistency, 3 major narrators. It's pretty difficult to explain away, but that's the conundrum.
Well, you anticipate my next question. I was going to ask, does Mormon or Moroni or any of the other things like the tribe of Nephite, do any of these characters appear in either the Old or the New Testament proper? Either one of you?
No. None of them do.
No. So would it be fair to say that this was sort of like the New World Testament that he was trying to present?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Mormons talk about the Old Testament as prophesying of a future Messiah, the New Testament confirming that he's born, and the Book of Mormon as another testament. The central theme of the Book of Mormon is that Christ will appear, and then one of the central moments in the book is Christ as a resurrected being appearing to the characters in the Book of Mormon after his ascension, after his death, and he appears amongst them, preaches the Sermon on the Mount, basically the same kind of sermon that he gave when he was ministering prior to his death. So, yeah, that's...
so the belief is that Jesus came to the New World after his death, unlike, say, the missing 20 or so years that some people think Jesus went to India and studied Buddhism or something. So this is post-life, post-mortem.
That's exactly right. Yes. So he appears as a resurrected being.
And would this have been in the first century then, would this have been in Central America, North America, South America, or was he all over the Americas supposedly?
Well, yeah. So the exact location is also another fraught question, but scholars at BYU have articulated a limited geography model that is basically southern Mexico, Guatemala area, suggesting that that's the location where the Book of Mormon largely plays out. So he appears to the people there, ministers to them for several days after his ascension.
Let me get back to something Patrick had mentioned. He talked about the issues of the day and Joseph Smith, in a sense, responding to them. So let me just ask a few questions regarding the early church, and then we'll move on to the wanderings westward and the transition to Brigham Young. But so as far as I know, were Native Americans considered the 13th tribe of Jews? Is that part of the tenets? Either one of you?
Yeah, right. So it's a good question. So one of the actually early attractions of Mormonism to many of its converts was that the Book of Mormon, at least as it was interpreted by early Mormons, including Joseph Smith himself, purported to be a history of the ancestors of Native Americans. That what the Book of Mormon is it starts in Jerusalem about 600 years BCE with a group of Jews living in Jerusalem with a prophet named Lehi, his son named Nephi, and their family. And they received revelations from God that they need to leave because Jerusalem is very wicked, and they build a boat and sail to the New World, presumably the Americas, as Paul mentioned. And so, and then the Book of Mormon is a 1,000-year history. It's this sprawling saga of this civilization, or actually two rival civilizations, which emerge out of this initial family. But it all goes back to Jerusalem. It all goes back to this family who were Israelites. And so the notion is that if these people came to the Americas and were the ancestors of the Native Americans, then the Native Americans, the native peoples of this continent, must be descended from Jews and must be part of the tribes of Israel. And there's a lot of content in the Book of Mormon that talks about them as Israelites and the kind of promises that God makes to them. Now, that's one of the controversies about this now, and in fact, the church has scaled back some of its earlier grandiose claims. Originally, there was talk that Book of Mormon told the story of ancestors of all native people in the Americas. Now the church is much more modest. As Paul said, now Mormon scholars argue for more of a limited geography that recognize that actually the Americas were peopled in lots of different ways. They're not dogmatic about this being the only or even primary peopling of the Americas. And so those claims about all Native Americans being Israelites or descendants of the Jews are now much more modest than they were in Joseph Smith's day.
I was going to ask that next. You anticipated again that since now we have genetic trees that show Native Americans usually coming back 13, 20,000 years over a land bridge. I know that there are some Native American tribes, for example, that have blue eyes, and there's a tribe, the Mandan tribes in the central U.S., that speak a language very similar to Gaelic, and some people have thought that an Irish prophet had come over 1,000 or so years ago. So there were all of these kinds of stories. So I just wanted to know if the church now, do they recognize maybe that it's more metaphor than history?
Well, I think the church is still committed to the historicity of the Book of Mormon, but they would say that its narrative is much more limited in scope. It's not continental, but rather quite local. And that over the course of many centuries, with the intermixture of peoples, that those genetic traits, of course, would be all mixed up as native peoples moved around and mixed together. And so you're right. DNA evidence, suggests that the origins of Native Americans and the native peoples of this continent come from lots. Do not just come straight from Jerusalem. And so the church is comfortable with that and has made more modest claims. And I should say too, during Joseph Smith's time, there were lots of other people who were also making similar claims about Native Americans being part of the the lost Israelite tribes, and trying to come up with how to explain the origins of native peoples here in the Americas. They had come up with theories to explain, the origins of people in Africa and Asia and Europe, but when they encountered the Americas, that forced Europeans to rethink what they thought they knew about the history of the world. So this is all this was sort of in the mix during Joseph Smith's time, and in some ways the Book of Mormon fits very well with these conversations that the people were having.
Getting back to the idea of Smith as a restorationist, when one thinks of the 19th century, a lot of times we think of Anabaptist movements, and we think of John Brown and Harper's Ferry. Was Smith someone who we know his views on Native Americans? What was his views about African Americans and slavery? Were Mormons in the 19th century abolitionists? Because I know that wasn't it only about 50 or 60 years ago that blacks were accepted into the church?
Yeah, Paul is the expert,
Paul,
so I'll defer to
Paul, if you will.
Sure. So let's see. There are a couple of parts to your question there. So first of all, were Mormons abolitionists? Some Mormons certainly were abolitionists, but not all Mormons were abolitionists. Mormons actually, in the first couple of decades, cast a very wide net. They accepted blacks, freed blacks, black slaves, and slave masters into their gospel fold. They accepted abolitionists and anti-abolitionists. And in fact, under Smith, there were two well-documented African Americans who were ordained to the LDS priesthood. So there was no prescription against black ordination in the first few decades of Mormonism. That developed later under Brigham Young in the Utah Territory. So in terms of Smith's vision, Mormons are in fact expelled from Jackson County, Missouri, after an editorial is published by the editor of the Mormon newspaper in Jackson County, W.W. Felt. He publishes an editorial simply titled Free People of Color. And he basically says in that editorial that Zion, or the Mormon gathering place, has been defined by Smith as Jackson County, Missouri. So to black Mormons, this is now the place you're supposed to gather, but be aware that Missouri is a slave state and has laws regulating your ability to move freely in this state. So if you're going to gather as a free black Mormon to the state of Missouri, here are two sections of the Missouri state code that you should be aware of. If you don't have papers substantiating your status as a free black person, you're subject to being whipped and expelled from the state. So he says there is no prescription against black Latter-day Saints. We have no policy against people of color. As in his editorial, just let prudence guide. If you gather to Missouri, be aware of the Missouri Code. Outsiders in Jackson County, Missouri, read this editorial and perceive it to be a threat to their way of life in Jackson County, Missouri. They accuse the Mormons of inviting freed blacks to Jackson County, Missouri to incite a slave rebellion and to steal their white wives and daughters. So accusations of race are leveled against Mormons as early as 1833. And this actually begins the process of Mormon expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri. Before this series of events plays out, there are 1,200, 1,500 Mormons who are expelled from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833. So they are accused of being too open and accepting of black people. One accusation leveled against them in Missouri is that they have opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free blacks, that they actually promote black ascendancy over whites. Those are some of the accusations leveled against them. And it leads, one of the charges that will help fuel the fire that will lead to their expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri, and then Clay County, and ultimately from the state of Missouri altogether, under a state-sanctioned extermination order in 1838.
Well, go ahead. Keep going if you need.
To fill in a little bit about Smith's perspective himself, by 1836, because of what has happened in Jackson County, Missouri, he does articulate a position where he advises Latter-day Saint missionaries preaching in the South that they should convert the slave master before and get the slave master's permission before they preach to black slaves. And he also reinforces the notion of the curse of Ham, that black people are servant of servants in that really fraught sort of a way in which 19th century Christianity sort of shored up slavery. Smith buys into that, says that this is something that God has placed upon blacks, meaning slavery, being servants of servants, and until God decides to do something about it, man should not interfere. I see it as sort of an expedient position that he stakes out in 1836 out of a desire to protect the missionaries as they're preaching in the South, as well as to push back against this accusation that Mormons are inviting free blacks to the area to incite slave rebellion. So he's sort of bowed to the racial order of things, especially in the South. By the time of his death, he has adopted, as he's moved into Illinois, a different stance. He actually advocates for government-funded emancipation of slaves, that the government should honor the notion that slaves are property, and so honor the cost of the slaves and purchase them into freedom. That's what he advocates in his presidential platform in 1844. And he argues that black people are equal or equal to whites, and their status in life has just been relegated where it is simply because of slavery. So slavery doesn't allow them an education. Giving them an education, they can attain the same achievements that white people can, or even greater, he articulates before his death.
Well, I want to talk about a couple of other tenets before we move back to the historicity of moving out to Utah. I'll get to polygamy in a moment, but I wanted to talk about the Mormon relationship to the idea of Jesus Christ. Is Christ seen as the Son? Are Mormons Trinitarians? Do they believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost? Or are they Unitarians? Or what is their belief system of the hierarchy, if there any? Patrick, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So Mormons do believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as other Christians do. The distinction, however, the Mormons are not Trinitarian. They believe, and this goes back to some of Joseph Smith's teachings, especially late in his life, that in fact God the Father and Jesus Christ are embodied gods, that they have physical, tactile bodies, each of them separately. That the Holy Spirit is a person of spirit, but actually the three of them do exist entirely separately from one another, even though they are, he would say, one. The church would say one in purpose, one have a kind of singular character and purpose and perfection, but they are not essentially unified the way that the Trinity is typically taught. So Mormons will not use the Trinity; they'll speak instead of the Godhead, of the three members of the Godhead: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so Jesus, though, is accepted as the Son.
Yes, so Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior and Redeemer of humanity, who wrought an atonement for the sins of the world. So all of that very classical Christian notion of who Jesus is, Mormons would accept, but they put their own particular gloss on it, and theology does play out in different ways because of the particular distinctions they make in the Godhead.
Let me talk about the relationship that Mormonism has with other religions outside of Christianity, specifically the other Abrahamic faiths, because we've talked about Christianity's relationship to Mormons, whether they are considered Christians by themselves or by others. One of the odd things people will find about Mormons is that they refer to non-Mormons as Gentiles, just as Jews do. So a Jew to a Mormon is a Gentile. Where did that terminology come from? And what is the relationship between Mormons and Jews? Is it antagonistic? Are they seen as the devil or whatnot? Either Paul.
So the relationship between Mormons and Jews has always been quite favorable. And no, they don't see it as Jews as devil or anything else. In fact, the Book of Mormon says it's explicitly for Jew and Gentile. It's a message of Christ as the Redeemer, aims at Jews as well as at Gentiles. And Mormons have always had a favorable relationship with Jewish community. And then the second part of your question, the notion of Gentile, Mormons sort of developed this identity for themselves in the 19th century, where they come to see themselves as fallen, as descendants of ancient Israel, those who are responding to the Mormon gospel message. Brigham Young says have bleeding blood in their veins. He articulates it that way, and that means that, in fact, he says we are redeeming Israel. We're recovering the last Israelites and redeeming them. And so they come to see themselves as a reification of ancient Israel and identify with Ephraim in particular. And then everyone else are defined as Gentiles. And so that would lead, Mormons in the 19th century even to include Jews in that notion of Gentile. Anyone who is not a Latter-day Saint was defined as Gentile under that understanding of who they were on the inside versus who people on the outside are.
I believe, Paul, that...
Fair to say that nowadays the word Gentile is somewhat fallen out of favor in Mormon parlance. It's still there, and you'll hear it occasionally, but oftentimes more tongue-in-cheek. Mormons know that it sounds a little bit strange to refer to others as Gentiles, and so typically they'll simply speak of those who are non-LDS or non-Mormon or not members of our faith. Gentile is still built into the language, but it's somewhat fallen out of favor.
I think it was Paul who mentioned that Smith had been called a modern-day Muhammad. What is the relationship between Mormonism and Islam, if any? Are the Muslims in general, whether they're whatever denominations, Sunni, Shia, or Sufi, or whatever, what are they viewed as? Are they viewed as just more Gentiles, or is there any antagonism there between Mormonism and Islam?
Mormons had a remarkably open vision of religious pluralism in the 19th century. So under Smith in Nauvoo, Illinois, the city ordinance of religious pluralism articulated a variety of religions that were welcome to worship and live amongst the Mormons in Nauvoo. The only non-Christian denomination specified was Muslims. And so Smith actually articulated that Muslims are welcome in Illinois and welcome to live amongst them in this idea of religious pluralism. He was, like mentioned earlier, labeled and branded the American Muhammad, and there were all kinds of accusations. I have a chapter in my book, Oriental, White, and Mormon, the way in which outsiders looked in on Mormons and defined them as more Eastern than Western, that it was corrupt Eastern religion, that Mormons actually gave over their free will to the despots Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. That's one way in which they paralleled in America's minds. They paralleled Eastern religions, and then they practiced polygamy. And so in those two ways, outsiders, even the Supreme Court of the United States, argued that polygamy was the preserve of Asiatic and African societies, not something that white people should practice. So, that's the way in which Protestant America defined, one of the ways in which they defined Mormons as other was by labeling them more like Muslims, Turks, Asian, than they were like white Anglo-Saxons, because they weren't doing what white Anglo-Saxons were supposed to do, that is, be monogamous and participate in American democracy.
Well, let me pick up on that. When they say Asiatic, are we referring to Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism? Are there any parallels between Mormonism and those traditional non-Abrahamic religions?
Not really parallels at all, but those are just the ways in which sometimes in the 19th century outsiders attempted to situate Mormonism and suggest that it's more Eastern. So they would place them alongside those Eastern religious traditions and say that really what we have growing up on American soil is something more Oriental than it is Western, something more suspect. We don't even recognize it as a Christian tradition, in other words. And so by associating it with Eastern religious traditions, it's one way of defining Mormons as other.
And how about the Mormon view of agnostics or atheists? Were people who didn't believe in any God somehow lower than an outsider religions? What was their belief about people who had no religious belief whatsoever?
Well, I think so Mormons have, as Paul said from very early on, Mormons expressed a pretty robust belief in religious freedom and pluralism. It largely came out of their own experiences of not receiving the benefits of First Amendment protections, especially in Missouri and Illinois. Generally, when Mormons talk, both in the 19th century and today, generally Mormons have spoken about religious freedom and religious pluralism in terms of all of the different religions of the world. And their Mormonism at its best has a real kind of generosity towards people of other faiths and other traditions. Agnosticism and atheism have always been a little bit harder for Mormons to swallow, simply because, of course, at the bedrock of Mormonism is a deep theism and a deep belief in God. I think Mormons now are becoming more comfortable, especially in the United States, as and in Europe, as they encounter more people who are atheist and agnostic. They still don't quite get it. I think Mormons are typically offended by a kind of militant atheism, and so they see themselves as part of a grand coalition of people of faith who need to, uphold the dignity and relevance of faith in the modern world. But in terms of day-to-day life and being neighbors and co-workers and all that kind of stuff, Mormons are quite comfortable, living alongside atheists and agnostics, along with people of every religion.
In the second segment here, I want to talk about the history of from Smith's death onward through modern times, and I want to sort of take a brief tour of the historical and political sides of Mormonism. But we have to talk about polygamy. As I mentioned, I'd done recently a show on polygamy, which wasn't focused on Mormonism, but generally world polygamy. And the fellow I interviewed had written a book, and he told his argument was that basically it's been studied that polygamy tends to foster some of the worst instincts in society, i.e. that only the rich guys, the guys at top, get all the women, and this fosters social unrest. And it was a very secular take on it. Let me ask about polygamy within Mormonism. Was that originally part of Smith's view? Why was it a part of his view? Then in 1890, the church bans it, and that fractures the church. So let's talk about polygamy. Was this part of Smith's original vision? Why? And then why was it eventually banned? Let me start with Paul this time.
Sure. So, one thing to keep in mind when you're talking about Mormon polygamy is that Mormons go from monogamy to polygamy and back to monogamy in a 60-year time span. And those two bookends, the introduction and the abandonment of polygamy, are wrenching for Mormonism. So it wasn't a part of Smith's original vision. Some suggest that the notion of polygamy comes to him as early as 1831. He doesn't actually write down what he claims as a revelation until the 1840s, and introduces it in secret. And so it goes through three phases. The initial introduction is secret, and then by 1852, Mormons openly acknowledge polygamy, and they openly acknowledge that they are in polygamous relationships. And then it returns to secrecy by the 1880s under the federal crackdown, so that you might approach a polygamist in 19th century Utah in the 1880s and ask if he or she were married in polygamy, and they might deny it simply because federal marshals are roaming the territory and throwing polygamists into prison. So three phases: secrecy, open period, and then back into secrecy. And we know the most about that middle phase because it's openly practiced, and Mormons are not in their polygamous relationships. Smith claimed that he receives a revelation from God, that it is a part of the restoration of all things, reaching back even to the Old Testament patriarchs, and that God told him to do it. And so you have the introduction of polygamy, its open practice, and then the abandonment of it in 1890, when the Supreme Court has opened up the way for the confiscation of LDS temples. So the trade-off in 1890 is preserving temple worship and abandoning polygamy. Mormons preserve temple worship and are sacrifice polygamy when the Supreme Court begins the process for the confiscation of LDS temple properties.
Oh, and Mormons worship at temples, not churches, then, technically speaking.
No. Mormons worship in both. So Mormons have temples which are open to during the week and closed on Sundays, and open only to those who meet the highest standards of Mormon faith. And then on Sunday, they worship in chapels open to visitors and people of all faiths or of no faith. Oh,
and Saturday is the Mormon Sabbath, correct?
No? Sunday.
Okay. Well, let's... Okay, go ahead.
Sunday is the Mormon Sabbath. Temples are closed on Sunday, and neighborhood chapels are open to people who want to visit and worship with Mormons on Sunday.
Okay, and Patrick, do you have any comment on polygamy, or did Paul sum it up pretty well?
I think there's a lot more to say. Polygamy is one of those topics we could talk about for a long time. I would agree with everything that Paul said. It was not originally a part of Joseph Smith's theological vision. In fact, the Book of Mormon speaks out in opposition to polygamy. And so it's part of Smith's evolving revelations and theological view, but it does become a central part of the Mormon worldview and theology and practice for a few decades in the middle of the 19th century before it's given up. And Mormons, even though the vast majority of Mormon history has been monogamous, that period was such a crucible, and it was so formative, both inside the faith and, of course, for outsiders, that the Mormons still have lived down that history, even though it's been almost 130 years since Mormons gave up the practice. It still continues to shape the religion and outsiders' perceptions of the religion in really powerful ways.
Well, I want to talk about the history in the next segment. I want to talk about Brigham Young and that stuff, as well as 1891 is abandoned. We'll do that in a moment. I've spent the first almost an hour talking about the tenets and the founding of Mormonism with Paul and Patrick. Now I want to talk about some of the highlights of the last century and a half or so. So let's talk about the transition from Smith to Brigham Young, because certainly Brigham Young University is the most well-known, I guess, university in the faith. That as far as I know, there's not a Joseph Smith University. But so how did? Well, let's talk about the death, the end of life of Smith, and how was Brigham Young picked as the new leader? And was it Brigham Young who promoted polygamy? So let me start with Patrick.
Sure. So Joseph Smith, as we've we've talked about, the Mormons had been expelled from Missouri in 1838. They took refuge in the state of Illinois and founded their own city, which they built literally from the ground up, called Nauvoo. And for a few years in the early 1840s, this became really kind of a small Mormon city-state. They had extraordinary political powers that were granted to them by the Illinois state legislature. Joseph Smith enjoyed extraordinary prestige and power within the city of Nauvoo, not only as prophet, but he also had political roles and even military roles and other things like this. And conflict began to escalate again between Mormons and their neighbors who believed that Mormons were much of a threat. So these were not just theological conflicts, but these were political conflicts, economic conflicts, social and cultural conflicts that boiled over. There are many, many factors. It's a rather complicated story, but essentially it culminates in 1844 when the Smith is being held in a jail in Carthage, which is a town nearby the city of Nauvoo. The governor of the state had assured his safety. He was there with his brother and a handful of other followers, but a mob attacked the jail in Carthage in June of 1844 and killed his brother, injured there were two other men in the cell with them. And with this, by the end of 1844, the founding prophet of Mormonism is dead, as it's been violently killed by a mob of vigilantes. And so this led to, this of course was a great crisis for any new religion. The grand question, can you survive the death or disappearance of the founder? Can you move on to a second generation of leadership?
Yeah, this is basically the thing that's divided Islam, the Sunnis and the Shias.
That's exactly right. Islam, and any other. There are new religions that pop up all the time, especially in the United States and around the world. But they come and they go and they disappear, and they are usually associated with the charisma of the founding figure. Successful religions are those that can survive for the second generation and then beyond that, and are able to survive that crisis of leadership. And so Mormonism does have a crisis of leadership. Joseph Smith. The problem wasn't that he had not named a successor, but actually that there were several people who believed that he had named them or designated them as his successor, or that they had earned that role. So in the months and following the death of Joseph Smith, there were multiple claimants who stepped forward, who said that they should lead the Mormon people. That they should take on the role of Joseph Smith in one way, shape, or form. The largest group and most serious claim always was with what were known as the 12 Apostles. So as we said, Mormonism is a restoration, or claims to be a restoration of ancient Christianity. So it had not only a founding prophet, but it had 12 apostles, just like Jesus had. Brigham Young, by the time of Joseph Smith's death, was the head of the apostles, was the senior most, or president of the apostles. And so he stepped forward and said that the leadership of the church should go to the 12 apostles, rather to some of these other claimants. The largest of Latter-day Saints accepted that claim and believed that the 12 apostles lead the church. Other groups split off. This was the time of fracture for the movement, and so other groups followed other leaders, and many of those movements still survive today. They're of various size, all of them smaller than the largest group, is the LDS Church. But essentially, Brigham Young emerges by 1847, 3 years after the death of Joseph Smith, as the clear leader of what are now known as the Latter-day Saints. He will be the one to lead them west across the United States to what we now know as Utah. And then sort of the rest is history. And then there's an unbroken succession from there, where the senior-most apostle at the time of the death of the president of the church then becomes the next president of the church. And so that's where Brigham Young really steps into his role and becomes the leader of most of Latter-day Saints after the death of Joseph Smith.
Now, Brigham Young, at least in terms of, if you look at paintings or read accounts, seems to have been far more charismatic, far more fiery. He seems to have been a firebrand, whereas Joseph Smith was the prophet. He was sort of there's in science there's Charles Darwin, and then there's T.H. Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog. It seems that Brigham Young seems to have been Smith's bulldog in a sense. Is that an accurate assessment of who Brigham Young was? Paul, maybe if you want to go.
Yeah, his most common nickname is the Lion of the Lord. If a book bulldog equates to a lion, then that's probably a pretty good assessment. He was known for bombastic sermons, very bombastic style of preaching. Also, his letter writing would sometimes be fiery. I think he saw his mission as preserving a people, leading a group of 12,000 religious refugees to the driest expanses in continental, what would become the continental United States, and leading over, presiding over the settlement of over 300 Mormon towns in the Inner Mountain West. Sort of his legacy that he leaves, and actually preserving a people. And I think it took a very strong-willed person to do so. But in terms of Mormon theology, he also leaves, some complicated issues behind. Like we mentioned earlier, he introduces a race-based priesthood restriction into Mormonism in the 1850s. And that's what we see that Mormonism struggles to deal with all the way to the present. They abandoned that in 1978, but struggle with the reasons behind Brigham Young's introduction of that racial restriction. It's a complicated legacy, and he is very much a strong leader who is able to preserve a people and hold them together and build successful settlements in a very inhospitable region in the process.
Now, the term Deseret, or is it Deseret? I don't know how it's pronounced. Is it Deseret?
Deseret.
Yeah. Was Utah founded by the Mormons as Deseret? Did they want it to be a separate nation? Were they looking, though, to get, or just to have a Mormon state within the U.S.? What was the political aims, and was it Brigham Young the driving force for that?
Well, so you have to remember, when the Mormons arrive in the Great Basin in July of 1847, they are arriving in northern Mexico. They are actually leaving the United States, and that's a very purposeful decision. They have actually contemplated Texas, Oregon, and Alta California, or Upper California, which sort of describes the geographic region that included the Great Basin. Simply because they have come to conclude anytime they intermingle with outsiders, it proves to their disadvantage, and they've been driven out. So they are, in fact, religious refugees when they arrive in northern Mexico in July of 1847, and nursing considerable animosity towards the United States because they feel like they have not received the kind of protection that they have from the federal government. The federal government has always described the Mormon expulsions as states' rights issues, and the Mormons feel like the Constitution has failed them. It's failed to protect minority rights. And so they are seeking a place outside of firm state control. They actually zero in on the Great Basin as a location where Mexico doesn't have adequate control of, and they feel they can establish their religious kingdom there. Within 7 months of their arrival, they find themselves back within the bounds of the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the U.S. war with Mexico and transfers the territory on which the Mormons have arrived into U.S. hands. And so then the question for the Mormons is, what relationship will we take with the United States? They contemplate territorial status. They contemplate applying for statehood. They settle on applying for statehood and make an application which gets caught up in the Compromise of 1850. They apply as the state of Deseret with very expansive geographic boundaries, including California coast. San Diego would have been in that proposed state had it been accepted by Congress. Congress rejects it, whittles the borders down, and doesn't like the term Deseret. It's a term that comes from the Book of Mormon, means honeybee, and applies the name of the Ute tribe to the entity they define as the territory of Utah. And that is a part of the Compromise of 1850. California is admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are treated as territories under the principle of popular sovereignty regarding the question of slavery.
Now, was there, I seem to remember off the top of my head, was there one particular president pre-Civil War who really hated Brigham Young and wanted to, was there a de facto stealth war waged by the U.S. against the Mormons?
That's right. We call it the Utah War. President James Buchanan orders a 2,500-man army to Utah in 1857 to suppress a reported Mormon rebellion and to replace Brigham Young as governor. So as a territory, you don't get to elect your own governor. Governors are appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate. And President Buchanan is convinced that Mormons are only loyal to Brigham Young, not loyal to the United States. He's also received reports from federal judges in Utah Territory that Mormons are in open rebellion against the United States. And so he sends a 2,500-man army to Utah to replace Brigham Young as governor. And that Utah War plays out 1857, 1858. No pitched battles between federal forces and the Utah Territorial Militia. But the Mad Meadows Massacre grows out of that very fraught context.
Well, what was the role of Utah during the Civil War? You said it was a territory, it had sovereignty. Was the state leaning slave? Was it leaning free? Or was basically it just out of sight, out of mind for most of the Civil War?
Well, it's largely out of sight, out of mind. Lincoln does allow for the Nauvoo Legion, which is the name of the territorial militia, gives them a 90-day appointment to guard the overland trail and telegraph routes, but is still very suspicious of the Mormons. Brigham Young swears loyalty to the Union during the Civil War, and Lincoln most famously simply says, well, when I was a young kid and we had a stump in the ground that was too big to pull out, we would just plow around it. And that's what I'll do with the Mormons, just plow around them.
So let's talk then about the post-Civil War Reconstruction, and when does Utah become a state, and when does Brigham Young die, and what is the transition post-Young?
Brigham Young dies in 1877, and it follows a similar transition process. The president of the Quorum of the 12, a man by the name of John Taylor, then leads the church for 3 years as president of the Quorum of the 12, and then will constitute the highest governing body called the First Presidency after 3 years. And Utah eventually gained statehood in 1896. But remember, polygamy and theocracy are the two things that Congress consistently tells the Latter-day Saints they must abandon, the two things that Congress consistently says define Mormons as un-American. And so polygamy, 1890, then Mormons in 1891 abandoned the People's Party, which was the Mormon party in territorial Utah, and start to adopt the national two-party political system. And Congress and the president sort of watches this process play out over the next few years, and by 1896 deems Utah sufficiently Americanized to admit it into the Sisterhood of States.
Well, let me turn to Patrick then. Let's look at the 20th century. At the turn of the 20th century, most of the Western states are being admitted in. I think 1907, maybe Oklahoma, the Indian Territories might have been the last state before Alaska and Hawaii. So by the turn of the 20th century, by the start of the First World War, has Utah, have the Mormons generally been Americanized, as Paul stated?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty remarkable transformation where in the 1880s, Mormons were considered really one of the top public enemies in the United States. I mean, consistently in every year during the 1880s, the President of the United States in his annual address to Congress identifies Mormons as one of the chief threats to the nation. That's in the 1880s. By the time of 1898 rolls around, so 2 years after statehood, Mormons are participating with the rest of the nation in the Spanish-American War. Mormons are one of the very first, Utah is one of the very first states to fulfill its quota of volunteers to send to the war. And by the time you get to 1914, well, of course, the U.S. enters World War I in 1917 and 18, but by that time, Mormons have been thoroughly Americanized in the sense that they have laid aside their open antagonism or any antipathy with the nation. There's a little bit of a rocky period in the first decade of the 20th century with some hearings of a Mormon apostle who's elected to the Senate that is protracted and sort of dragged out some of that old opposition. But for the most part, Mormons, they want nothing more by the early 20th century to be mainstreamed, to be welcomed into the national fold, to be seen as true and patriotic Americans, just with a distinctive religion. And it's actually pretty remarkable that within the space of only about a decade or two, that transformation is secured. It's I think one of the truly remarkable about faces in American history.
I know that Jehovah's Witnesses don't accept blood transfusions. Were Mormons, do they have any such prescriptions? And also, are Mormons now, by the 20th century, have they adopted anything like pacifism or what?
So no, Mormons don't have any prohibitions against blood transfusions or any other kind of modern medical procedures. Mormons are quite open to modern medicine and modern science. In terms of pacifism, as a pacifist myself, I wish more Mormons were pacifists, but the tradition is not a peace church. The story of 20th century and 21st century Mormonism has been one of the church supporting nation, whatever nation it finds itself in, and so you'll find patriotic American Mormons, German Mormons, and Filipino Mormons, all participating in the armed forces of their respective nations, and so there is that has been one of the factors which has led to the success of Mormonism over the past half century, is the way that it has successfully navigated national and international politics so that it could send missionaries around the globe. In parts of the globe, there's parts of the globe where Mormons do not send proselytizing missionaries, especially in Muslim-majority nations, and that's for political considerations. But most Mormons will send their missionaries around the globe, and that really one of the chief values of the church, to get along with local governments so that they can preach the gospel and try to converts.
Well, you anticipated again, this happened several times. I was going to ask, because I was born in 1965, and by the time my mind was just getting started and around 5 or 6 years old, when I would hear about Mormons, the two things I would think about would be missionaries and going around the world, and of course the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which would often have television specials where they'd be singing at Christmas time or whatnot. So by say the mid 20th century, had the antipathy against Mormons in the U.S. basically gone away to the point that they're just that odd little, religious people off in the desert someplace. There wasn't any of that, like you said, in the 1880s with presidents railing against them as a threat. By mid 20th century, are they just another, little church out there that people didn't really? Some people may not have even heard of Mormons, Patrick.
Well, I'd say yes and no to that, and I'd be interested in what Paul thinks. I mean, Mormons did achieve, especially in the United States, a wide degree of acceptance as part of 20th century American religious pluralism. They were even hailed in the 1950s as really kind of model citizens. There are a number of times the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is an important part of this story. The Mormon welfare system is lauded by national officials as a great example of people taking care of themselves in local communities. A high-ranking Mormon becomes a member of the cabinet in Dwight Eisenhower's administration, and then we, just kind of fast forward all the way up to Mitt Romney receiving the Republican nomination, and so the story is one generally of acceptance and accommodation and Americanization. At the same time, at the level of sort of interreligious relations and theology, there continues to be a fair bit of opposition to Mormonism, especially by evangelical Protestant churches. I think in large part there are some long-standing and acute rivalries there. Many of those who are converts to Mormonism come out of Protestant backgrounds, so I think there's a kind of competition for souls, which needs some of this. But in the 1970s and 80s, and continuing today, evangelicals, there was a considerable anti-cult movement where they identified a number of different groups as cults. We've mentioned this before. Mormons were identified as one of the preeminent and most dangerous of these cults. Many sort of conservative evangelical preachers and writers.
Well,
And so
are the charges of cultism labeled against the mainstream LDS, or is it these outlier Mormons that, you have the stereotype of the 65, 70-year-old man who has a bunch of teenage wives? Is the charge of cultism still tied to polygamy and these outlier groups?
No, it's charged against the mainstream LDS church, and it's not tied to polygamy. It's tied mostly to theological beliefs. So they would say that Mormonism is a dangerous theology and anti-Christian theology, and they produced a number of books and videos and things like this, which often get shown in evangelical churches. And so any Mormon missionary going around, especially the United States, but I think in many other places in Europe and Latin America, where this kind of anti-Mormon literature and sentiment has taken hold, they oftentimes encounter it as they knock on people's door. That many people don't know an actual Mormon, but they have heard about Mormonism through this network of anti-Mormon teaching.
Well, let me just ask, and I'll go to Paul here, because we talk now here about anti-Mormonism in the U.S. and in Christianity, but I think Paul had mentioned earlier that a lot of the missions don't go to Muslim nations and states. Is that because Islamic states, and I don't mean ISIS, but recognized states, are they seen as demonic or the preachers of the devil in Iran or Algeria or Egypt?
No, it's out of respect for sometimes Muslim majority countries have laws against it, out of respect for local custom, as well as some Muslim majority countries explicitly prohibit it. And so Mormons are cautious on those grounds. It's not out of any animosity towards Islam. It's out of respect for the laws that govern those kind of relationships, and also not wanting to cause anyone any harm if a person decides to convert.
I just want to sort of end up this interview talking about the current state and towards the future too. So let me just talk about Mormonism and the state of Utah. What percentage of people in Utah are now identified as Mormon? How many Mormons live in other states or around the world? And has the charge of theocracy within the state of Utah gone away? Either one of you?
So there are about 60% of the population of Utah that identifies as Mormon. Some locations like Salt Lake City are predominantly non-Mormon. The county, Salt Lake County, about 50-50. And then some counties, like Utah County, upwards of 80% LDS, but the state as a whole is 60% now. Has the accusation of theocracy gone away? If you talk about politics in Utah in the 21st century, I would say that no, the accusation hasn't gone away. That especially those who don't fit into the predominantly right-leaning and Republican-controlled legislative agenda feel disfranchised in the state, and also sometimes, like the LDS Church, wields undue influence over the legislative process. So those aspects become a part of Utah political culture. The other question, in the 1990s, statistics for Mormonism transitioned from being only a U.S. Populated religion to more Mormons living outside of the U.S. than within the U.S. Mormonism passed that threshold in the 1990s. So today, more Latter-day Saints live outside of the continental United States than inside the U.S. Large populations in Central America, growing in Africa, the Philippines as well.
Well, let me just ask, because you had mentioned how evangelical Protestantism is very disfavorable to Mormonism. It's odd that the Republican Party, which in modern times of the last half century or more is more considered right-wing and fundamentalist, I would think that that kind of politicking would be averse to any Mormon who has a historical background. You would think they would be sort of averse to this kind of exclusionary kind of rhetoric. Is that an odd kind of marriage politically? What do you think accounts for the fact that most Mormons would be considered now right-wing or Republican, as we modernly defined it in the 21st century?
Well, I'll just briefly weigh in, and then I'd be interested in hearing Patrick's thoughts on this. But in Utah, which I study, we see the transition taking place in the 1970s. So Orrin Hatch is elected in 1976 as a senator from Utah. He unseats a sitting LDS Democrat for that Senate seat. He's a newcomer to politics, and he ousts a sitting Mormon Democrat. Politics in Utah during the Great Depression and World War II were heavily Democratic. Utah voted 4 times overwhelmingly for FDR. And then post-World War II to the 1970s, relative parity between the parties. Utah shifts dramatically to the right beginning in the 1970s and culminating with Reagan's election in 1980. And you see the percolation of all of those social, or what the LDS Church defines as moral issues. So
things like abortion, homosexuality, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So the ERA, gay rights, and Roe versus Wade, all of those things kind of coalesce to a realignment of politics, and Utah shifts dramatically to the right and has stayed there ever since.
Patrick, what are your comments on?
Yeah, I mean, politics makes for strange bedfellows, and so it's certainly true that the Republican Party was founded its founding platform was to eliminate what it called the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. So anti-Mormonism was built into the original Republican Party platform in the 1850s. Obviously, the Republican Party has changed over time. We've seen this with lots of other groups. African Americans, of course, were overwhelmingly Republican because Republicans, that was the party of Lincoln until the Great Transition in the middle of the 20th century. And so we see these kinds of political shifts all the time. I think it is it's been an interesting process for Mormons to become political allies with evangelicals, even while they remain theological opponents. And so since the 1970s, over these kinds of values issues, moral values that we've identified, abortion, same-sex marriage, the ERA, school prayer, other things like that. Mormons have found themselves on the conservative and traditional values side of political ledger in the United States, which put them in an alliance with evangelicals and other conservative groups. So they would duke it out in the church pews, but then go to the polls together.
Yeah.
And that's part of the strange nature of American politics and culture, is that sometimes people make marriages of convenience in the political realm, even while they have severe disagreements in other areas.
Well, let me just, as we wrap things up, and I want to talk about the future, let me just ask then, so is current Mormon church belief then that abortion is the murder of a child or a human being and a sin? And are they against, for example, was it in 2015 or 2016, I forget now, or whether it's a year or 2 years ago now, are they against gay marriage? I mean, you cannot get married same sex within the LDS, but they would have to now legally recognize two males or two females as legally married, correct? They can't discriminate within the state.
Right. So the LDS Church's view on abortion, it is certainly against abortion. It does not have the same hard line as Roman Catholic doctrine, or even many conservative evangelical churches will allow for members of the church to receive abortions, especially under the direction of a doctor for medical reasons, or in the case of rape or incest or things like that. But in general, certainly it would be true that Mormons are pro-life and against abortion. In terms of same-sex marriage, the LDS Church was famously or infamously, depending on your point of view, very much on the front lines of the fight against same-sex marriage. In Hawaii, in California, most prominently in 2008 with California Proposition 8, a lot of people argued that it was the LDS Church, its efforts and its resources and its investment in the issue that put that proposition over the top, which did ban same-sex marriage in the state for some time until the courts overturned it. Of course, now the church recognizes that the legal reality has shifted with the Supreme Court's decision. The church abides by that decision and recognizes the legality of same-sex marriages, but it denies the validity of same-sex marriages within the confines of the church. And so, if two Mormons, two Latter-day Saints were gay or lesbian and had a same-sex marriage, they would be subject to excommunication within the church. So the church is no longer fighting on the legal front per se, but it had drawn a pretty hard line against same-sex marriage within the church itself.
Now, let me just look towards the future, because Mormonism was founded, as was mentioned, as a restorationist faith, but certainly for religions, it's gone through back and forth with the polygamy, and we've mentioned some of these other social issues. So the church has shown in 200 years to be quite malleable, if you want to call it that. I know recently my wife and I were here in Waco, Texas, which has a lot of fundamentalists, and we came across this place that was selling their organic food. They call themselves Bible-believing Christians, and they were an Anabaptist sect. Is Mormonism open, for example, to future prophets, or was Joseph Smith the only one and true prophet? If a person came along in 2040 and had a further revelation from Mormon or Moroni or one of some other angel, I guess the Book of Mormon, the sequel or whatnot, are they open to that kind of revelation, or is what Joseph Smith wrote bedrock? Either one.
I'd say yes and no, and then Paul, you can jump in. I mean, so Mormons do, one of the core beliefs of the church is that there are still prophets and apostles today. So actually, every president of the church since Joseph Smith is considered by Mormons to be a prophet. So Brigham Young was a prophet, John Taylor was a prophet, and today Mormons believe that the head of the church, a man named Thomas Monson, is also a prophet. And so that will continue. Now, the nature of prophecy has changed, and Mormons would be skeptical of anybody, especially who comes from outside the church hierarchy, who comes in and says, I had a vision of an angel and here's new scripture for you. And so that kind of ecstatic, charismatic experience of prophecy and prophethood that we saw with Joseph Smith, that has very much been domesticated within essentially the machinery and bureaucracy and ecclesiology of the church. Mormons do believe in continuing revelation. It's a bedrock belief that the Holy Spirit continues to work within the church and inspires both individual church members and church leaders. So Mormons would say that prophets do receive revelation and the Lord continues to speak to the church today, but it's not in that same kind of ecstatic, earth-shaking way that we saw with Joseph Smith. In fact, Mormons would be very uncomfortable with Joseph Smith today.
Yeah. Paul, any comment?
Yeah, I think Patrick put that quite well. Mormonism believes in a continuing revelation and an open canon, so that a prophet could receive a revelation that could go through the canonization process. It's a part of sort of the founding principles of Mormonism. And Joseph Smith sort of put in place a very interesting dynamic that, for the most part, has worked for Mormonism. It's at once hierarchical and democratic. Kathleen Flake, a religious studies scholar at the University of Virginia, said that Joseph Smith is the Henry Ford of Mormonism. He wants everyone to have a revelation. And so within Mormonism, people in the pew can claim their own revelations, but only within their own sphere of influence. So a father could receive revelation for his family, a mother for her family, but only one person receives revelation for the entire church, and that is the president or the prophet of the church. So one person at a time receives revelation for the entire body of Christ, but each member of that body can receive revelation for themselves to function in their families or in their ecclesiastical positions.
Well, I wanted to just get each of you to give a closing remark, but before I do, I'd be remiss, since you had mentioned the ERA and we talked about other ethnic groups. What is the role of women in LDS? Can women become, I guess, what are they called, ministers or preachers? I don't even know the term. And could a woman one day head the Mormon Church?
Go ahead, Paul. So currently the answer is no. So the LDS priesthood at the local level is a lay priesthood, but open only to men.
And the leaders are priests. They're not minister. They're not. They're called priests.
Well, the head of a LDS congregation is called a bishop.
Oh, okay.
But young men age 16 to 18 are ordained priests. And so, starting at age 12, young men in Mormonism are ordained into what is called the Aaronic priesthood or lower priesthood. So, deacons, teachers, and priests are young men within Mormonism. And then elders, high priests, bishops, apostles, a part of the Melchizedek or higher priesthood within Mormonism. And that's open only to men currently. Women function in a variety of roles in Mormonism. So Joseph Smith organized the Relief Society in the 1840s in Nauvoo, which is the female organization. Each ward or congregation in Mormonism would have has a Relief Society president that presides over the women's organization. There's also a young women president that presides over the young women in the congregation, and then a primary president that presides over the youth age 0 to 12. So they function in presidencies within each congregation, and also at the general level in those roles, but are not ordained to the priesthood and cannot lead a congregation as a bishop. There are active feminist groups within Mormonism advocating for female ordination, but currently that's not possible.
Well, let me ask both of you then, just to give you final opinions about the future of Mormonism. And I want to just phrase it this way, because both of you have the ability to write about or look with a more secular eye and a historical eye, as well as both as of you saying you have been believers or are believers in Mormonism. So we're here in the early 21st century. Both as a historian and a believer, what do you see as the future of Mormonism? Do you see, I mean, and I'm asking you to be speculative because, we don't know what technology will bring. Humanity may go out to the stars. We may have, as some people think, a robo-apocalypse or something where we all end up in the Matrix or something. Do you see a Mormonism as continuing over the next few centuries, much as it has? Do you think it's going to grow worldwide? What is your general future? Let me start with Patrick and then end with Paul.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a prophet, so I'm not very good at prognosticating these things. But I think as I look forward, I think the LDS Church will continue to grow at a modest pace. I don't think it will see the remarkable growth that we saw in the late 20th century, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. Or at least it's certainly not in the next few decades, as you say. I mean, once you project out 100 years or something, who knows? All bets are off. But in the short to midterm future, I think it will see modest growth, especially in the global South. I think Mormonism has sort of flatlined in terms of growth in the United States and Europe, and we might even see some contraction in some areas. And I think this is part of broader processes of secularization that we see in those societies. But at the same time, Mormonism retains, and I think will continue to retain, a very strong core. Mormonism, there's a kind of sociological genius to Mormonism that produces rather intense loyalty among its followers and ability to maintain that across the generations. There's a kind of almost ethnic flavor to Mormonism, in the sense that the people feel it's not just an organization that you're a part of. It's not like the PTA or something like that. It's not even like a lot of other denominations, but there's a sense of peoplehood, a deep and intense feeling of loyalty that is produced not just among multi-generational Mormons, but even among many converts who come in and are welcomed into the fold. And I think that sense of peoplehood is going to give Mormonism a unique sense of power, and I don't mean that in a nefarious way, but I mean that in the sense, I think a parallel might be the way that the Jews operated in 20th century America, a relatively small minority, certainly with a history of persecution and being a kind of outsider status, but they were able to marshal the talents and contributions of the community to box way up their weight in terms of contributions to society, in terms of culture, politics, all kinds of things. And I think Mormonism is going to try and figure out in the 21st century what is its contribution to culture going to be. I think Mormons are going to box above their weight in terms of their size, but in terms of the issues that Mormons are going to care about and make influence on the broader national and global culture, I think that's yet to be seen. I think we see some movements in that direction in terms of humanitarian effort, refugee assistance and relief, religious freedom. There are some other issues that are starting to sort of congeal within the Mormon community, but that's what I see is a relatively small, concentrated community that I think tries to do that has a transformational effect on its own members, but also tries to have real influence in the world.
And Paul, as Patrick was just stating, what are your views of the future? And do you think that, for example, Mormonism, because Patrick seemed to suggest that it may be getting a bit more liberal as time goes on, in the sense that maybe, who knows, in 50 years, women will be able to become the heads of the church or something. Do you see Mormonism as opening up somewhat from its traditions? What do you see playing out in the future?
Yeah, I think Patrick's right. Even the Book of Mormon itself suggests that Mormonism will always be a small group, one of a kind, two of a nation kind of a thing. I think Mormonism, we could look to the future to international locations for potential of Mormonism and what it has to offer. So places like Brazil, places like Africa, to kind of see what kind of future the LDS faith has to offer a global population. And, in terms of, liberalizing, I think that's an interesting question. If we look back in the 19th century, Joseph Smith, far more than liberal, even radical, sort of the kind of introduction of his theology, as well as marital practices, economic communalism, those type of things. So the sense that Mormonism is sort of inherently conservative comes really from a 20th century kind of position. And so I think that liberalism has always been in Mormonism and has potential on, like Patrick said, sort of social justice issues that are yet untapped, issues of humanitarianism, the question of female ordination, because Mormonism has the notion of continuing revelation. That is always a possibility. If the LDS prophet claims a revelation for female ordination, then Mormons go with that, and there's an open process for something like that to take place. So those possibilities are there, embedded within Mormonism, embedded in its theology, are possibilities of new directions, and that's one of the exciting things about Mormonism in my estimation.
Well, I want to thank both Patrick and Paul for an interesting and stimulating discussion. I will link to their web pages below this video. People can click on there if they want to find out more about those two. I'll also link, I guess, to the main Mormon Church website as well. So again, thank you very much for talking for a couple of hours about the history and future of Mormonism.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.